Before I do anything else, yes, thank you, my co-host extraordinaire. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. My name is Victoria Silverthorne. I am the GNC NIS Nutrition Information Systems Help Desk. Thank you so much for joining us on rather short notice. So today we're going to be looking at the exciting Nutrition Humanitarian Needs Analysis Guidance for Piloting. And just before we dive into this, please make sure you are muted and ideally to not have your video just to ensure proper bandwidth for everyone. It is being recorded. During the presentation, please in the bottom corner, or I don't know how it's set up on your screen, there's a chat function, and I invite you to pose your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and then we will have plenty of time, at least 20 minutes, questions. So that would be the best way as they come and you feel inspired to write your questions during the presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time to address them. Okay, let's begin. So over the past few months, thanks to funding of UNICEF and OFDA, myself and the GNCP and a number of other individuals that I'll provide further details have developed this guidance for piloting. It's quite important to highlight the piloting because it is quite important that this is the first time that we have a guidance like this, and I'll go into a bit more details what it includes, what doesn't it include, and why we would certainly want it to be piloted as well. So first of all, the process for its development, what is its purpose and the steps. I will provide some overarching details on a list of indicators. We always get very excited about indicators. So here we do have a recommended core list when it comes to situation analysis and the infamous PIN calculations, the people in need. We will also have plenty of time for questions and answers, as well as a final kind of leading piece in terms of next steps through a fancy poll. In terms of the development process, the Global Nutrition Cluster has been working towards improving the quality of the needs assessment and analysis for nutrition in emergencies at country level, including data collection, data analysis, and preparation of humanitarian needs overview. This guidance has been developed through the Global Technical Assistance Mechanism for Nutrition, generally more known as GTAM, because that is already quite a mouthful, where we have a sub-working group, so the Nutrition Information Systems Global Thematic Working Group, but also even a subgroup under that, which was a task force. So a specific task force was established in October 2019, and during that meeting, there was a number of key recommendations on how country platforms should prepare and conduct a needs analysis and prepare the key figures for the humanitarian needs overview. My work then started in January this year for the past couple months, and it involved a very consultative process. A number of calls were taken with the task force, but also with the wider GTAM NIS working group to really understand how can we best streamline the process and steps when it comes to nutrition humanitarian needs analysis.
Victoria, just to say, could you possibly speak up just a little bit? I think some people are having a little bit of trouble hearing you. So maybe if you could just get a little bit closer to the mic, that would be great. Thank you.
Is this better?
That sounds good to me, I think, yeah.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. All right, get back in the swing of this. Perfect. So the purpose of this guidance, first of all, The main aim is to provide a step-by-step streamlined process on how to guide discussions and consensus building on situation analysis and nutritional needs analysis. It is certainly meant to be iterative, as many subsequent versions will be prepared once it is piloted, but also if new guidelines are released. Colleagues at UNICEF are also already working on wasting estimation guidance. So once that is ready, we'll always make sure that this guidance has the most up-to-date information and guidelines available. It also aims to ensure an evidence-based and results-oriented collective response. That is quite important because we want to make sure that all partners around the table can reach a consensus and use the results in an informed manner. This guidance does not yet include information and considerations for the joint intersectoral analysis framework. I imagine a number of you are familiar with this framework and methodology that was proposed last year. Once the methodology is ready and a bit more consolidated, an addendum will be prepared and provided alongside this guidance. Also, this guidance does not aim to be prescriptive nor comprehensive with its 3 scenarios, and I'll touch in further details what are those 3 scenarios, nor with its core list of indicators. This is really more how can we streamline at a minimum the indicators being used, the analysis process across different scenarios that we often encounter. Also, given the COVID-19 pandemic, a number of things have been changed, to say the least, and the best source of guidance for NIS, so in Nutrition Information Systems considerations, would be the briefs that are prepared separately by the NIS Technical Working Group of GTAM, which is readily available on the GNC website. I'm sure a number of you have already seen the first brief, as well as on the newly launched GTAM website. So now moving on to my slides, here we go, to the purpose and the steps of the guidance. So first of all, there's 3 sections. We have how to develop an annual nutrition assessment plan. I think this is quite relevant for all countries. And that's an important consideration for this guidance that I probably should have mentioned earlier. This is a guidance for all nutrition needs analysis, regardless of whether there's a cluster activated, nor if there's an HRP, no HRP. So it really is cross-cutting all countries and all needs. For this annual nutrition assessment plan, we have considerations to be taken into account, such as seasonality, the reliability of a number of data collection methods, and also details on who should be a part of this process. And ideally, there should be some sort of NIS technical working group or assessment working group or any equivalent that may be present at country level. When it comes to a nutrition situation analysis, here we start having different approaches based on the 3 following scenarios. First, situations where an IPC, acute malnutrition analysis, can be conducted or utilized. So that kind of is one series of recommendations. If ever an IPC, acute malnutrition, cannot be conducted for whatever reasons, and yet the levels of acute malnutrition in children under 5 are of primary concern, so a prevalence above or equal to 5%, then we have another separate series of considerations and steps to take into account. And thirdly, situations often found in our Latin American countries situations where global acute malnutrition for children is under 5%. So we have these 3 scenarios, and through these next 2 steps, how to conduct a nutrition situation analysis and how to prepare key figures for the HNO, there are going to be slight differences for each of these scenarios. Now to the recommended core list of indicators. Here we've prepared this list of indicators through the task force and also through the wider GTAM NIS members. And once again, it's really how can we streamline this analysis process while not overriding any other lists that can be of indicators that can be used for programming or monitoring purposes. So it's certainly not meant to be comprehensive. We used a number and selected a number of indicators, not only in terms of its importance, in terms of guiding response planning, but also for the phase characteristics and thresholds of international standards that currently exists for global acute malnutrition and its contributing factors. As we can see here, it's a little bit blurry, I apologize, but we have a category that's provided, and then how does it align with the primary framework that we're basing our analysis on, which is the IPC Acute Malnutrition Framework, the details of the core indicators to guide response planning, and then the humanitarian consequence that it refers to. We have two main humanitarian consequences that are of importance for nutrition. We have physical and mental well-being. So these consequences have a direct effect on people's survival, mental and physical integrity, and or dignity in the short term, while recognizing they also have longer-term effects. So these are primarily based on anthropometric data. We also have living standards, which have direct effect on people's ability to pursue their normal, productive, and social activities and meet their basic needs in an autonomous manner. So they also manifest in different types of deficits and use various coping mechanisms to meet basic needs, such as lack in food, access to healthcare, water and sanitation, and so forth. So here, as you could see, depending on the scenario, whether we're in a scenario where we have higher levels of GAM for children under 5 or less, the prevalence of stunting would fall into different humanitarian consequences. It would be much clearer in the guidance why this difference, but it's just to show that we're really trying to streamline as much as possible, even down to the humanitarian consequence level. We also have the severity scale based on both IPC and OCHA phases, so 1 through 5, and the sources used for thresholds. Please note that a number of these thresholds are preliminary in nature because they don't yet exist at global level. To provide a bit more of an overview of indicators, because I imagine a number of questions will be received on these, we do have this set that I'm displaying are kind of the more primary indicators that are often used throughout the various steps of the guidance. So first we have our primary nutrition outcomes based on acute and chronic malnutrition. As you can see here, the main focus is generally children under 5, but also we have prevalence of global acute malnutrition based on MUAC, mid-upper arm circumference, for pregnant lactating women, as they're another key vulnerable group that is important to consider. Here we have also contextual factors. So these contextual factors are optional, and it may depend on the humanitarian situation whether they would be relevant to include at the various stages of the analysis or not. We have overweight, so if we're in contexts where the double burden of malnutrition may be present. We have also acute malnutrition for other vulnerable groups, older people and adolescents. We have micronutrient deficiencies with a primary focus on anemia, although we do include many more details on the PIN calculation for micronutrient deficiencies, mortality indicators that I imagine a number of you are familiar with, as they're often collected in the SMART surveys. And we have a huge list of key contributing factors. When it comes to IYCF, we have exclusive breastfeeding for infants 0 to 5 months, but also children 0 to 5 months or 6 to 11 months who are not breastfed and who have access to breast milk substitutes, supplies, and support. So these were kind of two key indicators that were put forward by the IFE core group for this guidance. And we also have some immediate causes in terms of food consumption with the minimum dietary diversity and minimal acceptable diet. So we do have quite a comprehensive list here, as well as indicators from the WASH sector, indicators on immunization, health status, availability of and access to health services, and food consumption. So it's quite an extensive list. And remember, each of these also have thresholds, whether being adopted at international level or being preliminary in nature. Next one, here we go. When we have these indicators, then we're able to start conducting a nutrition situation analysis. So to our left, we have our scenarios 1 and 2, where ideally an IPC acute malnutrition analysis would be conducted. If through contacting the Global Nutrition Cluster Core Team or the IPC Global Support Unit, this is not feasible, then we have a number of steps that will guide you on how to do the severity classification based on GAM using weight for height, because thresholds are provided. Although we do prefer now the aggregate indicator for global acute malnutrition CGAM that maybe a number of you are familiar with, that looks at both acute GAM based on weight for height and GAM based on MUAC. That would only be used for the next stage of PIN calculations. So it is not used here for severity classification because thresholds right now do not exist. If ever we do not have GAM based on weight for height at country level, then we would resort to using GAM for children under 5 based on MUAC. And then even in more rare circumstances that indicator is not available, then we would base our severity classification on GAM for pregnant and lactating women based on MUAC. In any case, a qualitative analysis of contributing factors would also accompany this situation analysis, similar to what is done with IPC acute malnutrition, where we have whether each of the other indicators that we're looking at, whether it's a minor contributing factor, so phase 2, or major contributing factor, phase 3, or if it's considered a critical contributing factor, falling within phase 4 or phase 5. And this is all, once again, based on those thresholds that I've showed previously. In our third scenario, so whether in cases where prevalence of under 5 GAM is less than 5%, then the severity classification is using a proposed scoring system based on 10 indicators that take into account both vulnerability of the target groups and indicators reliability. The first kind of upper tier of the indicators include exclusive breastfeeding for children 0 to 5 months, minimum dietary diversity, stunting and overweight, and as well as anemia in children 6 to 59 months. The second tier includes anemia for pregnant women and the percentage of children 0 to 5 months and 6 to 11 months that are not breastfed who have access to BMS supplies and support. And lastly, the third tier of this scoring system includes GAM for older people and GAM for adolescents. So depending on the phase classification and where it falls within phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, and 5, then an associated score will be provided and an overall score will be given based on certain thresholds to determine the overall severity classification. So a bit more elaborate process for this scenario, but hopefully this is something that would help guide you, and evidently certainly something that needs to be piloted. As already presented, an accompanying qualitative analysis of contributing factors would also be done. Now moving to the last section of this guidance is how to prepare key figures for the HNO and also the subsequent HRP. So the results of the nutrition situation analysis lay the foundation for a coherent and efficient humanitarian response based on the magnitude identified. And it's really through identifying the number of people in need, so this is our magnitude, that we're able to adequately support response planning. So the PIN, the number of people in need for each specific nutritional need, would be calculated in each geographical area based on the previous situation analysis of data and information. Generally, the nutrition situation analysis, and these calculations, these nutrition figures calculations are generally done in a parallel manner. So that's also something to take into account when planning to use this guidance. The calculation is generally based on the estimated incidence or prevalence of people that need that specific nutrition service. So we provided in this guidance a minimum subset. So once again, we're not trying to be comprehensive as there's numerous nutrition specific interventions that can be considered, but we're provided a minimum subset where the number of PIN, the PIN can be calculated. This includes 3 categories, so acute and chronic undernutrition and overnutrition, infant and young child feeding practices, and micronutrient deficiencies. To provide a quick snapshot of what that actually looks like in the guidance, I know it's quite busy, but just to show that we're showing the nutritional need, and based on the nutritional need, the alignment with a subset of the WHO's high impact nutrition interventions. What are some potential population groups to include? The indicators, while also highlighting which ones are from our core list from our nutrition situation analysis, and key considerations, and details of the PIN calculations. As we can see here, clear formulas per relevant indicator are included, and any disaggregation by sex, age group, and disability should be done when data is available. And the best part for last. With this guidance, which is, of course, will be a Word document, we've also prepared an accompanying spreadsheet calculation tool. So for all steps of the guidance, there would be an accompanying way to do automatic calculations where we could insert certain key figures and obtain the results that we need. So for the development of an annual nutrition assessment plan, we have the indicator registry. So as you've been seeing already on the nutrition cluster caseload calculation tool, we have our large table on the classification threshold. So all that list of recommended core indicators is included. The different steps on how to conduct a nutrition situation analysis. So we have a repository of all the evidence and its reliability. We also have a spreadsheet on the analysis team composition. So this was also inspired, to say the least, from the IPC acute malnutrition tools. And we have different tabs depending on which scenario we fall in, whether it's scenario 2, the nutrition situation analysis, where an IPC acute malnutrition cannot be done, and what would be those steps. And then also scenario 3, which has that a more elaborate proposed scoring system based on 10 indicators, and how would that take shape once being used to determine the overall severity classification. When it comes to the preparation of key figures for the HNO and the subsequent HRP, we also have spreadsheets where we can enter all the latest population figures, that is disaggregated by sex and age group, as well as disability if available, and automatic calculations of the PINs For each of those three categories, so acute and chronic undernutrition, infant and young child feeding practices, and also micronutrient deficiencies. So this summarizes the key questions, the key components of the guidance, and I'd like to open the floor now for the next 15-20 minutes on some questions that have arose. I saw there was clicking on the Skype, on the chat as I was presenting, so I imagine there's a number of questions coming my way.
Thanks, Victoria. We've got two questions lined up for you. One from Cécile about the admin level, and also one suggestion from Jacinta.
So the admin level, that's a great question. So we would like the second admin level, wherever we have data that's most reliable. If by the OCHA colleagues at country level, if it's at admin level 2, admin level 1, wherever we have the most reliable nutrition demographic information, that would be the level that would be included. And that you can, tweak within the spreadsheet tool as you insert them. You can also change at what admin level this corresponds to make sure that it is streamlined. But there's no kind of, if you only have admin level 1 or even, a broad population figure, that won't hinder the rest of the process. And a question from Jacinta, sorry.
Yeah, there's a suggestion from Jacinta in the chat regarding food consumption.
And what about food consent as a proxy indicator? So yes, in terms of food consumption, adding MDD for women. So we had this discussion and we definitely agree that was kind of one that was coming into play, but we were feeling that the children under 5 minimum dietary diversity would be the priority in terms of those indicators, but we do include MDD at more household level for the food security contributing factors. So that can be one, for example, if there's also readily available data on MDD for women that's available at countries, that also can be considered and potentially added. So this is where we're not quite sure. Right now we want to streamline the process as much as possible, but any recommendations on what else can be included or adapted, this is where we really, the piloting and the next steps that we'll discuss after would be quite crucial.
Super, thanks for that clarification. We've also got a few more here. One from Sanjay, how seasonality can be addressed while estimating PIN?
Ooh, that's always a fun one. I think, generally when we're doing a nutrition situation analysis, ideally we would want to already be taking into account seasonality. So the evidence that we're using to conduct the nutrition situation analysis should already be showing ideally the lean season, so that we know we're looking at a bit more the worst case scenario per se. But so that's where ideally we're already thinking about seasonality at the first step, even before we start estimating PIN. So the evidence that we're using and the estimations and kind of critical thinking that we're going into the nutrition situation analysis would already be taking into account seasonality, and then subsequently using that data that's available at a given season when estimating PIN. So it kind of, you almost need to start thinking about seasonality from the first step when you're already planning your annual nutrition assessment plan, to have kind of more primary up-to-date data that can feed into estimating PIN later on.
Super, thanks for that. We've also got another very topical question from Tariq here in terms of movement restrictions. Do you have any suggestions with regards to that?
Absolutely. So within this brief, it touches, it provides a bit more reference to the newly released kind of briefs led by the GTAM group in terms of nutrition information systems, monitoring, and surveillance in the context of COVID. Evidently, COVID is quite particular in nature, and on the Nutrition Cluster website and the GTAM website that was just released, provide a number of recommendations on what to do in terms of the movement restrictions, specifically in terms of the PIN calculations and the inability to conduct primary data collection, so conducting surveys at household level. We also are in the midst of providing a second brief that would provide specific details to that question on how can we use secondary data readily available within your country from various sources to estimate PIN in the context of COVID-19.
Okay, great. Well, that's very helpful. There was also just a final question there from Tariq about what are the best indicators to address the living standards humanitarian consequence? I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I'd say I'll just resort that kind of, you know, there's a huge list, as you can tell, of indicators, but there are a number of indicators that we're suggesting, particularly in terms of nutrition. Remember, this is our sector streamlined guidance. In terms of living standards, you know, it's cross-cutting across different sectors. So what we did, we pulled a number of living standard indicators from the WASH colleagues, from the food security colleagues, so that we are encompassing that within our analysis of contributing factors with regards to nutrition. So there are a number of indicators that are listed, but I think it'd just be easier to provide the list than enumerating each one that is listed here.
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of information. This is quite a weighty guidance document.
Yes.
May I come in very briefly? Stefano.
Hi, Stefano. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I was wondering if you could add a few more details, please, to explain how we can increase the frequency and the rapidity of the situation analysis, in consideration that the COVID pandemic is rapidly developing around the world, but also we see recurrence in some countries. So, and this is happening while at the same time many countries are still vulnerable to natural disasters or ongoing crisis. So the increased ability to be more flexible to the changing needs and develop more rapidly situation analysis for nutrition, which is usually hampered by the expectation that we need to have hard survey data and recent survey data of a given quality before we can make any statements. So how do we see this approach facilitating the frequency and the recognition that this is a valid situation analysis that allows us to advocate and guide program scale up and responses? Over.
Excellent question, and incredibly useful as well, as you highlighted, Stefano, with everything COVID-19 this year, but also in general years where, you know, there's one thing after the other that may happen in terms of almost a domino effect in certain countries. I think, you know, now that we have a streamlined process and guidance, that we have a step-by-step guide, but also an accompanying Excel tool that would really facilitate each of these steps. Hopefully this will enable countries to run these analyses more frequently, but also in a more streamlined manner. So if they use certain information last year, that we would have a repository on what information was used, how the assumptions would be captured. And so if there are any revisions that would be needed subsequently, then we can already resort back to that information in a more streamlined, kind of condensed manner, because it would all be present within the same tools. Even down to population figures that were being used. If we, we only have population figures from last year and we need to update it this year, and often there's a population, growth factor to being taken into account, that's quite, simple to add, and then we could rerun the analysis and the PIN calculation. So hopefully that is truly one of the primary objectives of this guidance, is how can we facilitate it being done in a more efficient manner, particularly that it is very much an iterative output, right? And where we're trying to see how to capture at most what is happening now to the best ability that we can, and particularly given these movement restrictions that are currently happening. I think in that upcoming brief that's being developed, we're also providing guidance on how to use for somewhat modeling or foreseeing how many more people in need we will be having in front of us.
Super. Victoria, there was an interesting question from Isaac. Do you have an example in terms of the scoring system for the scenarios? Do you have an example of how it works in classifying the nutrition situation of an area? Do you have anything to
Isaac,
add?
you give me such easy questions. Okay. Well, I won't, I'm nervous I might lose quite a few people if I start going into it, but basically an associated score is given per indicator. So if so for example, exclusive breastfeeding for children under 5 will weigh a bit more than global acute malnutrition levels for older people. We're thinking of more the vulnerability of certain age groups. Once again, of course, maybe in certain contexts, older people are going to be more affected than the younger children. So this is where it is very much to be piloted, this sort of scoring system. But once again, we wanted to kind of streamline the process as much as possible for scenario 3, because it is quite complex, as there's probably a variety of indicators coming into play, much more than in our global acute malnutrition, being of primary concern, so above or equal to 5%. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe it'll be a little taster for you, Isaac, to dive into, to check out a bit more how it is being done on scenario 3.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for that, response. I think I'm very interested, because I was imagining, the combination of all those factors or indicators. In the end, I don't know whether that situation would be describing under 5 or community. That's something which I was wondering. So, but anyway, we can talk offline. But that's something which I was thinking very much.
Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, so another question from Mohammed as well, in terms of balancing out the data that you'd need to collect in terms of COVID, with the COVID restrictions, but also using previous data in case that was not feasible. Any suggestions, Victoria, for that?
I think this is going to be the question that will be coming up more and more. I believe, it's not always so straightforward. Certain governments have different movement restrictions in place. Also, people might have data that was just collected maybe a couple months prior or earlier this year, versus others have not been able, given high levels of insecurity in a given country for numerous years, not to collect information. So I think the use of secondary data analysis will be quite important regardless. And I think it's more of a question of how do we reach a consensus on what would be most evidence in terms of steps of what evidence to use, what information, how can we make some assumptions, but also how to be transparent. I think, right now the most important is how can we just document any assumptions that are being made, And of course, myself as the GNC MIS Help Desk will be readily available to support countries in having those discussions and, you know, seeing what kind of, as of course, there's multiple factors coming into play right now.
Great to know that you're on hand, Victoria, for all of those tricky questions. So there's the question from Leah on the nutritional status of pregnant women. Maybe we could just bring that slide back again. I think it was laid out.
Yes, and we're using actually a cutoff. Here we go. We're actually using preliminary thresholds based on Somalia's Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit. So we are basing, we are using MUAC for the assessment of nutritional status in pregnant women, and we are having preliminary thresholds because right now they do not exist. And we're going to see how those take form.
Super.
Maybe one more question, and then I do want to get to my fancy poll.
There's the question from Cecile, speaks to you, Victoria, but maybe also Anna, I'm not sure, in terms of timings for this year for the HNO process.
So right now they are finalizing, the templates are ready, and I believe the earlier you start, the better in terms of already looking at your nutrition assessment plan. What data has been collected, will be collected, is in the process of being collected, and you could already start diving into the guidance and seeing, okay, do we have these indicators, do we not have these indicators, and already start considering what can be used for your upcoming nutrition situation analysis. But generally, yes, it generally is looking around more August to October, but I know countries, as mentioned already by Tariq, that people are already starting to situation analysis, also just given the COVID situation that we have at hand right now too. Great. So with this, I would like to launch a poll. So please let me know if everyone can see it. But ideally, this is now based on what has been presented, our discussion, what would be the best way forward? Would it be to provide feedback now on the guidance before it is widely shared for piloting? Or would you prefer pilot testing the guidance now and to provide feedback as it's being used? So please take a moment to vote. I hope everyone I'm seeing votes come in. I feel I should add some music for this part, I guess, in our presentation. We have about half that have voted, please. There we go. I see the numbers continuing. So we have about 10 more colleagues who have not yet voted. If you could please lock in your vote.
Almost there.
Yep. And we have 7 more colleagues. even if you click, you have to still click submit. So just make sure it has been submitted. And it's actually quite important, these last couple votes, because it's quite even. So I would appreciate if everyone can vote, or maybe a number of these individuals are my colleagues on the core team, so hence why maybe they're not voting. Right. Final 20 seconds.
Maybe we can use a few more words in indicating the differences between the options. Just
Well,
what
yeah,
makes more sense and in some ways and versus another.
absolutely. So the first option is we share the guidance to whoever wants to review it now internally before we send it to all countries. The second option is all countries can now pilot test the guidance and provide feedback as it is being used. All right, we have 4 more people, so maybe I'll just wait a little bit more.
I think the rest are part of the core team, no?
I guess the rest is a part of the team. Thank you, Stefano. I just can't see the list. Okay, so and what I will just now project is the results. Can everyone see the results?
Yep.
Yes, great, thank you. So I guess based on the consensus here, colleagues would rather pilot test the guidance now and provide feedback to myself as it's being used. Once again, you know, there will be probably some tweaks and considerations. We already had a number of points raised today. For example, the minimum dietary diversity for women. So I think, you know, based on this, we will send the guidance and the Excel tool by the end of the week so that colleagues can start taking a look and start piloting it, as we already see a number of countries already starting nutrition situation analyses. Well, maybe, I'm just thinking ahead, we'll maybe just wait until end of next week, just as the French presentation has been changed to next week. So we'll just wait until we have this presentation with our Francophone colleagues before we share the wider guidance. So stay tuned. And I believe with that, we're going to close this session. So thank you again for your active participation, whether through the poll or through questions. And I look forward to being closer in touch with you regarding this nutrition humanitarian needs analysis guidance and accompanying spreadsheet tool. So thank you again and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much. It was really helpful.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
How do I do